Well, welcome, friends. I am excited to introduce you to my guest today. I'm speaking with Mark Buchanan. Mark is an author of 12 books, including the David trilogy, God Walk, and one of my personal favorites, The Rest of God. If you've been around on my newsletter, you know I've recommended that book multiple times. And he is now the author of a book called What Is Left of the Night, which is what we're going to be talking about today. He's also a professor, and he lives in Alberta, Canada. Mark, would you just tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself as we jump into this conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. It's really great to be back with you. Teresa, I was a pastor for many, many years, and the new novel, actually, the central character is a pastor, so that was just a wonderful world for me to explore. But I loved being a pastor. I loved the church, but 13, 14 years ago, I took a call to teach at a seminary here in Alberta, and it's just been a really wonderful journey where what I'd learned in the trenches, or in harness as a pastor, I now, in sort of a more serene setting, I'm actually dealing with crises every day, am able to try to understand even what I was doing. It's part of the beauty of any real calling is it's a highly intuitive thing, and you figure out how to sort of meet people where they're at, but it's not like you read at a manual, or a seminary training can only do so much in preparation. But it's been a really wonderful journey and difficult, because it's a steep learning curve to try to understand what was I doing, what was working, what was failing, how do I kind of pass that inheritance on to a next generation. So I've been doing that. I want to highlight too, my wife and I, my wife Cheryl, we started 5 years ago a remarkable, I think it's remarkable, she runs it, called a ministry called New Story Community, and it's a residency-based program with Indigenous women in recovery. And God grew that in her heart and in my heart, but in hers particularly over a long stretch of time. And as we started to, enter our 60s, we felt a little bit Abraham Sarish, like, God, you could have, we could have started earlier on this. But it's been an extraordinary journey of walking alongside these beautiful, brave women and seeing what happens if somebody truly kind of opens their heart to the Lord, His provision, His strength, His grace to, live the life we're called to live. I've learned more about discipleship in the last 5 years from these women than I did in all my years pastoring or professoring.
I love your heart for people. You see that as you're ministering to students and kind of passing on the things that you learned and are figuring out, even still looking back over those years. And then you and your wife, I love Cheryl's ministry, and just the way you're impacting women. That's very dear to my heart. So I absolutely love that ministry.
Yeah.
So let's switch gears toward the book that you wrote. Tell us a little, maybe you can give us a synopsis of what is left of the night, and then tell us what led you into writing, because you've been a nonfiction writer for years. What kind of steered you in this direction?
Right. So I'll answer the first question, the synopsis. It's a historical novel based on, as Netflix would say, real events. But I've tried to follow the historical plot line as closely as possible, and then dramatize it, but not I don't think in a melodramatic way. And sometimes just having to, invent backstory and connections and stuff, because we don't have historical record. But it's a story about a tiny little village in southeastern France called Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. And during the war, it's a unique, this little community, because in that area, it's mostly Protestant Christians in a sort of a country that's mostly Catholic, and long history of actually being persecuted. This community being persecuted. It's called Huguenot, and they just were hounded and hunted and imprisoned and killed. And what they it forms something in them, this sort of fierce devotion to the victim or the person on the margin. And it exists to this day. This village is mostly secular now, in terms of there's very little church activity, but they retain this sense of fierce devotion to the person on the margin. So they're a community that has an oversized population of refugees living among them, and some of the kind of backlash we've seen in countries like in Europe and France particularly against immigration, you don't find that in this little village. So this village in the 40s, as the dark shadow of the Reich, the Nazi regime, is sort of spreading across France. This pastor, who's an absolutely committed pacifist, he will, he wouldn't. I don't think he'd kill flies. I mean, I think we all get a pass on killing flies and mosquitoes, but I don't think Trocmé did that. And he wanted to sort of be involved for really kingdom purposes. That's how he framed it. In that time of war and conflict, and he turned the village and he talked to other pastors in their villages into, literally, he called it a city of refuge. So if the numbers thing, if somebody's being pursued, who's they're being accused of a crime they didn't commit, so these refugees, you have to give refuge to them. So this little tiny village of 900 people saved over 2,500 refugees, mostly Jews. This is a true story. So what I do is I take the bones of that, researched it extensively, got the main characters sort of from the story, invented just a few, and I tell the story of the main time from basically from 1942 to 1945, where it was full on. The whole village and villages around were involved in this rescue effort, and in pretty open defiance of the Vichy regime, which is a puppet regime of France, and then the Nazis themselves. And they would in a few instances, they said right to the face of these dark regimes, "We are hiding Jews, and we will never tell you where they are." Wow. So there was just this incredible kind of holy pluck and defiance. Mm-hmm. And so the story just in and of itself is magnificent and inspiring. And then what I did is I took it and kind of, reordered some of the time sequence and whatnot to kind of maximize how beautiful and how daring this rescue effort were. Not a single Jewish group lost their life during this. Several of the villagers did. They put their life on the line for this community. One last thing I say about that bit is, as I did the research, I realized some very interesting characters intersect this story, this place, this time. So the Nobel Prize-winning author Albert Camus, an Algerian French writer, famous for The Stranger and The Plague, which is one of his most well-known stories, kind of a COVID-like thing that breaks out. He's writing this novel in just outside this village at this time. And then Virginia Hall, a remarkable spy with a wooden leg. She actually shot her own leg by accident, and she ends up with a wooden leg that she calls Cuthbert. You can't make this stuff up, Teresa. She's now considered probably the most effective spy of World War II. Her story is just starting to emerge. She's working with the resistance just outside the village at this time. So, I mean, it's just too good. And historically, we Camus and Trocmé may have met. Almost for sure, Hall and Trocmé, the pastor, didn't. But they do. They all meet in my novel.
I love it. She was one of my favorite characters for sure.
Hall?
I loved her.
Yeah, she's formidable. I mean, I fell in love with Virginia Hall. I mean, she's a bit of a train wreck in some ways, but she was this woman from Baltimore who really puts her whole life on the line for it's almost like a secular version of Le Chambon, of Trocmé. She puts her life on the line for strangers. She does it in a violent way, and that's the difference between her and Trocmé. Trocmé won't do it in a violent way.
Right. So what made you kind of pivot into fiction?
Yeah, so thanks for that. I actually started as a fiction writer. Most people don't know that, but just because if they've read anything, it's like Rest of God or God Walk or whatever. But my first love was fiction, and that goes all the way back to a teacher in grade 5 who got me writing stories. And I just fell in love with the idea that you could make a whole world and invite people into it and kind of touch their imaginations and their emotions through telling a story about a dog runaway or something. And it's all made up. Like that just it seemed like a godlike power to me, honest. The sense of you could cast a spell with words. And so I started in my 20s. I was only writing really fiction. It was very thin publishing, like little journals and stuff like that. But I kind of stumbled into the nonfiction just because publishers started getting interested in some of the stuff I was writing for Christianity Today and whatnot, and they threw back in 1990 something, they threw a contract at me, and it wasn't for fiction. So I ended up, taking this long circuitous route back to my first love, which is fiction. So in 2020, I published the first of the David trilogy, and now that's complete. And then I knew that as soon as I completed that, I wanted to do another novel. So that is really just coming home. Yeah, it's coming home. The beauty about fiction is, though it's rigorous. Like if you write historical fiction, beware, listener, if you're going to write historical fiction, you have to be it's a more rigorous process than if you're writing, a nonfiction book about grace or something, because you have to get the details right.
Oh, okay. So you're actually talking to me.
Okay.
Because in my Bible studies, I kind of I try to stay true to the story, but I do a creative retelling of the women's stories. And I have this dream of doing a novel about the life of Bathsheba. So I actually just started the David trilogy because I was like, I want to see kind of how you do that, how you weave this truth of scripture and then also make it, a fictional novel. So
yeah. And so with a biblical fiction, I would so encourage you to do that, Teresa. And that the Bathsheba characters, I just finished teaching yesterday. I teach a whole course, 13 weeks on the life of David. And so many, especially of the women, were drawn to the Bathsheba character. And one of them wrote a short story about her, trying to imagine the backstory and whatnot, because we get very very little on her. And in the terrible scene where David summons her, she says not a word. She sends a note, but not a word. And then at the end of the story is, she's working the back room pretty hard. So, what's the arc between those things? Mm-hmm. And so that just invites this intriguing story. But one of the things that's helpful is things like The Chosen. And now the David series, the House of David. It's just, this kind of given, I think, people who well, that's not in the Bible. Well, I mean, the whole tradition of the Jewish Midrash is you try to imagine what's the gap between what the Bible tells us and what we actually, what might have happened. How did we go from here to here? So I would really encourage you. The other thing, though, is it's somewhat easier to write biblical fiction than like what World War II fiction, because World War II fiction is so massively documented from so many angles. And that's where you're going to have people showing up and saying, well, the trains didn't leave Paris, on this date, they left on that date.
Right.
Whereas biblical history, we don't know actually that much about the historical moment. What we have is a biblical record, and what you're going to have to navigate, and I really want you to write this book, but what you're going to have to navigate is people saying, where did you get this from? This isn't in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And again, I think something like The Chosen has kind of helped people say, oh yeah, it's fine to bring kind of a holy imagination to this work.
Yes. Let's hope it's well received someday when I get it written.
Well, I would, I don't say this to many people, but Teresa, I would love to be a reader on that and write a blurb or something, because I love the David story, and I think, he wasn't great with women. We know that, right? He was a bit of a cad. And I think that we need books that kind of give the women in the story their story back. I actually started writing the David series because and I'm as hubris because I'm a white man, but I wanted to give Mahal, his first wife, her voice. I wanted to give her her story. Because we've held her in contempt, this stern, scowling woman looking at the window. But she's a jilted she loved him, and he didn't really love her back. And so I just felt, man, I'd love to explore what a redemptive story would look like.
Yes. I feel like we could talk about this.
Oh, yeah,
we're
yeah,
not
yeah.
really here to talk
Right,
about
we're talking about the other thing. Okay.
So one of the things you talked about was the story is filled with all these ordinary people who are heroes, and it's so opposite of the world. Our world champions the popular and the famous and the this and the that, and I just think I want to talk about that heroism of just ordinary people who are just living their lives feeling like, what can I do? And the small choices that people make and what a difference it makes.
Thank you, Teresa. Yeah, entirely. Well, it follows the story historically that these were ordinary people. Trocmé, when the Holocaust Museum in the 70s wanted to honor him and his wife Magda as righteous among the nations, and there is a plaque to both the Trocmés and the village. He insisted that it was unless the Holocaust Museum, or what's called Yad Vashem, was going to honor the entire village, he didn't want to be part of it. So it's the only community honored as righteous among the nations. In the Holocaust Museum, every other honor or notice is for an individual. Now there is a little plaque just for the Trocmés, but he always refused sort of accolades and honors because he understood his own ordinariness. So it really does accord with historical record, but also it's way more interesting to sort of imagine me or you in our ordinariness and our sort of everyday fears and what can rattle us so easily and all of this sort of stuff. Is it possible in dire in a moment of national or international crisis that we actually might rise to some level of daring that unimaginable in times of peace? That is, I think, the intriguing thing. And I think about. I was just thinking the other day about the Lord of the Rings, of course, a piece of fiction, but Tolkien was so dialed into this theme of the ordinary. And everybody who aspires to greatness in the Lord of the Rings is evil. In other words, everybody who wants to, make a name for themselves, they're all evil. The people who actually make the difference and change the sort of the course, the tide, either are running from greatness or have no idea they have it in them. So it's Aragorn, whatever, he's kind of running from his own destiny. Or it's, these wee little hobbits who just want to smoke pipe weed and have second breakfast, right? And it's just, they're the ones who I have no idea I had it in me to sort of, face these very dangerous things. So I'm more intrigued by that because I love the idea that this could be me. But I don't know. I don't know until the crisis comes. And part of what makes Le Chambon, this little village, so intriguing is there's a lot of individuals during World War II who acted heroically, often the ordinary people. And there's organizations that were intervening in a heroic or kind of a daring way. There's only two communities that acted heroically or acted to sort of protect refugees en masse. One's in Italy, and I forget its name. The other is this little one in France. So in all of Europe, there's only two of these, and they're both small. that decided, you know what, we're not doing this. We're not just sort of being bystanders or sort of silent, complicit accomplices in the thing, which is what most of Europe did. We're not going to defy it. We're not going to, we don't like it, but we're not going to resist it. And what makes Trocmé and the Chambon so unique is they chose to do it in a nonviolent way. So they're not blowing up trains. They're not ambushing convoys. They're doing it with Trocmé actually preached, and it's in the novel, the day of the armistice sign in 1939. So that's when France hands over they hand over the nation to the Nazis. And they get sort of peace in our time because the southern France is under the Vichy, or a seeming French regime, but it's all puppet. That Sunday, well, all the other churches are ringing the bells saying, yay, we avoided war. Trocmé gets up in his pulpit and he preaches a stunning sermon called Weapons of the Spirit. And he's absolutely lucid. And he says, we are going to resist this in every way, but we're not going to do it with hate. We're not going to do it with war, violence. We're going to take the only weapons we're going to wield are the weapons of the Spirit. It is unbelievable how clear-minded this guy was at that moment when everybody else is rejoicing because they think they averted war.
As you're explaining, I mean, I read the book already, but I'm getting chills because I'm thinking, how would I respond in a situation like this? I want to say I would be that person, but I don't think so. I just feel
you don't know.
Man, how do you? I feel like the book really challenged me.
Yeah.
As I was reading, like, who would I be in this story?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, and I think you wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it unless there was a Trocmé around. So, the Hertiers, Emma and Holly Hertier, are real characters, and they end up being heroic in terms of just hiding refugees. I don't think they'd ever got around to it if it wasn't for a Trocmé. So I think that you need someone like that who's a bit of a, he's a catalyst. He's a he sparks the flame. But he gave everyone else courage. So I don't think it has to be everybody saying, let's do this, this very daring thing. I think it's a few people, and that we rally to that. And so I don't think this would have happened without Henri and his wife Magda. They were both amazing. But there's something in the people that was ready to rise to and respond to that clear-mindedness. And Trocmé himself was afraid. So it's not like he's super, he's not, some Marvel comic hero. He had fear, he had anger, he had all of those sort of things. So that comes out, I hope, in the novel, that he's having to deal with his own emotional stuff.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job of portraying these people as imperfect. And he's a pastor. And I love that because people tend to, even inadvertently, put people in ministry, they put them on a pedestal. Yeah. Oh, you're in ministry. You must be fill in the blank with this fantasy that they think, people in ministry are at a different level. And yet I feel like you really portrayed them in reality. Why is that? Why was that important to you?
Well, because I was a pastor for 24 years, and so I've lived from the inside this thing where you have to, without being hypocritical, you have to get up in the pulpit or in front of the people week after week and say, "Thus saith the Lord," or let us go in this direction, or this is what the Lord requires. While I myself struggled with it. I myself was going through some conflict within my home, or was completely, near shutting down from fear about, something going on or whatever. So I had to live in that space for 24 years. So I understood it. The other thing is so interesting is the relationship between Trocmé and Magda, the pastor and his wife. My editor at one point said, I can't believe that a pastor's wife wouldn't be, 100% supportive of her husband. And I said, because they're combative, right? Those two, and she has not any patience with theology and all that. And I said, first of all, you must not know many pastors very well. Then. And secondly, this is the story. This is the story as it emerges, and they themselves told the story. There's that little poem that I have in the book where and it's actually a little bit. He wrote it after the war, but I have him writing it during the war, where he says basically on Valentine's Day he writes a card for Magda, and he said, if I were to do it all over again, I would pick a wife that was nicer, sweeter, more serene. But then it wouldn't be you, so okay, I would pick you again.
Happy Valentine's Day. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. So you talked about how this city became known as a city of refuge. And I think, what does it look like for us to love our neighbor, that we think like, that's what I want to be. I want to be a refuge for people. I want to be a safe place. But what does it look like to actually do it and go beyond just our good intentions?
Wow, what a great question. I so wrestle with this because, it was interesting. I was writing this book during COVID, and actually we were living in the village, and we had intended in Le Chambon in France, my wife and I, and we had scheduled to live there for nearly half a year. And we had to leave the village because of COVID. We had to go back to Canada. And, but I, watching the world in a sense struggle with this thing, like the social distancing. And I remember going to a park and there's this cute dog, and I bent down and, just ruffled it, scratched it behind the ears. And this woman was absolutely livid because somehow I'd passed my disease onto the dog and all of that. So it was like an inhospitable days, if you recall that. And I watched in real time as I'm researching and writing this book, and having left the village because of COVID, how suspicious, how wary, how self-protecting an entire world can become almost overnight because of some new regime in a sense rolls in. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is as close an object lesson I'm ever going to get to what happened in the 1940s. Is this seemingly unstoppable force of the Nazi regime is saying now these people are unwelcome. They are, if you hide them, if you help them, you are an enemy of the state and all of that. And, basically it was kind of like all these decrees coming out of higher offices, and if you broke them, you were in trouble. And so that was fascinating. And I realized, okay, what does it look like to be hospitable in this time when it's you're putting yourself at risk for it? Well, all I could come up with as I sort of wrestle with that is that it's going to, and I'm not sort of advocating for sort of social unrest or whatever, but it takes some level of defiance. It takes some level of saying, I'm going to choose compassion. I'm going to choose, especially the person on the margin, I'm going to choose to welcome them and make a space for them, even if that's costly to me. So one of the things I got an opportunity to sort of online to address a lot of churches during COVID as I was researching this book. And I was just saying, the people who are suffering the most are not the people who have the yachts and, all of that. It's for them, it's just like a vacation almost, you get to stay in place, right? It's the pensioner living in a little apartment, whose daughter would come by once a week to see, and she can't now. And what does it look like that person, or it's a person dying alone? So many people died alone. And I honestly advocated for a kind of holy defiance in these things where sometimes you just have to break the law, and you actually have to kind of, and again, I'm not like an anti-whatever, anti-this and that and the other thing. I just think compassion has to have a priority over safety. And that's what this village chose every time. And I think that's just sort of I think when we think about our homeless population, I talked about my wife's ministry with Indigenous women going through recovery. It's a hard go. And every day we have to choose compassion over safety or safety for ourselves or comfort for ourselves, what's comfortable. And I think that it's a trained thing. I think that you train your soul in that, is you cultivate that. We know that. We've just seen, that's one of the disciplines of Christians throughout the ages, is cultivating the space of hospitality. Hospitality literally means welcoming the stranger. And it actually it actually is cognate with the word hostile. Hostile. There's one writer that calls it hostile fatality, because this could go wrong. This stranger could be dangerous or whatever.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's any possibility of, especially when things get distressed. Like, it's lovely that, you have these friends in the same socioeconomic bracket as you, and they're all, and you have them over to your lovely house, or they do you to theirs, and you make a wonderful meal and all of that. I wouldn't even call that hospitality. I just like this entertaining. Hospitality is welcoming the stranger, and you really don't know how this is going to play out, but you take the risk anyhow.
That is so, I don't know if the right word is convicting, but it's hitting really close to home. I don't know if you know, my husband's a pastor. He's been a pastor for 32 years.
Oh, gosh, I didn't. How fun is that?
Yeah. And we're in a church now that's more urban than any. We've always been in very suburban, very, just really safe places. Yeah. We're in a place now, we have homeless people, we have drug addicted people, we have all kinds of people every week come to our church. And I'm just thinking about what you're saying about compassion over safety. And even what does that look like in a ministry? Like, you've got children on the campus, and we're trying to navigate all of these things. And, what does it look like as a ministry? What does it look like as a one-to-one relationship? I just feel like so many things converge when you're trying to figure out that line. And yet we're called to love. We're called to compassion. And so often we're absorbed in self-protection, really. That's what it is. It's like, well, what about this? What if this happens? What if that happens? And
we're always protecting the vulnerable. So obviously, if this, we're not putting the children at risk or whatever. Right. But I have a friend who's a pastor. He got into pastoring later in life. He was in business and all of that. He loves it. But his first church was a suburban church, and he was bored out of his mind. And 3 years into it, he took a call to an inner city church, and there's people, who sleep in the stairwell of the church, the homeless, and he's loving it. But it's rattling the church, because even though they're in this demographic, they had not have a clear sense of the whole, this historic church. So over time, the community changed, and it's just a different kind of demographic, and so they've mostly insulated themselves from it. And he came and he candidated on, no, we're going to figure out what we do, how we live well with our neighbors. And our neighbors happen to be drug addicts and prostitutes and stuff like that. And so he is having the time of his life. And this church is starting to say, oh my goodness, this is better. It's hard. It's better. It feels like the book of Acts now. Now it feels like we're in the pages of the Gospels. Yeah. And that's just it. I would just encourage Christians. I mean, you nourish yourself on these stories from Scripture. Well, tell me when it's safe. Tell me when Jesus takes a safe route, or Paul and the early apostles. When they do, they get stuck. And then the Lord comes and sort of throws a bit of persecution around, and next thing you know, they're doing the mission. So the gospel is not written really, I mean, we can read it and understand it and apply it if we're in a very sort of safe, upscale, affluent kind of neighborhood or whatever, but it's not written to those people. The original audience were the clientele that you have at your church.
Yeah, I remember reading a book. I feel like it might have been David Platt, Radical, where he talked about, I'm not praying for my children to be safe. I'm praying for them to be dangerous. And
Oh,
I was like,
right.
oh, man, such a good thing. I've thought about that often. Like,
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like this sense of, I mean, safe for, the vulnerable, but dangerous. Like Jesus was safe for the woman who came and washed his feet, and dangerous for Simon, the guy judging.
mm-hmm.
Like he reserved his harshest critique, and the only time he got violent was anybody who was exploiting the vulnerable. And the
Yes.
people who are vulnerable, they found refuge in him. So I think that if we're reading this story in a kind of with what literary scholars call a sort of second naivety. So we've spoiled the first naivety, where we've never heard these stories before, and they rock us. Most of us grew up with these stories. We learned them in Sunday school. They got domesticated for us. I think what we have to bring is a second naivety to these stories of Jesus, the apostles, or just go back in the Old Testament and find out how much God says, hey, how about leaving everything and coming to a place I'll show you?
Yes.
The disruptiveness of the gospel, the disruptiveness of the call of God. And if we read them with a second naivety, it's like, oh man, you know what? It's not like I have to go ruin my life, but if I am not cultivating a space in me where I am willing, in the power of the Spirit, to take the risk that that where compassion, love, welcome, hospitality will triumph over my longing to be safe and to be comfortable. If I'm not, then I'm not actually reading the gospel. if I'm wanting always this comfort and the safest path.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, man. Before we pressed record, we were talking about how this book, as you were writing this book, you felt like you were kind of relating to the current day
Right.
in some capacity. I'd love for the listeners to know a
Yeah,
little
thanks,
more about what
Teresa.
you mean.
Yeah, when I got interested in the story 20-something years ago, I came across a little reference to a book by Philip Haley, who was a researcher and kept coming across references to this village, Le Chambon. And he went there and he found this incredible story of these people who very quietly, without boasting or hardly talking about it, rescued these 2,500 Jewish people. And he wrote it up in a book, a beautiful book, but it's not he wasn't an historian. He was just trying to capture the story in its raw form. And the book is called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed, which is the refrain around in Numbers for the city of refuge. So 25 years ago, I read this book and I was like, oh my goodness, I love that idea. And then, I kept sort of coming across this story. And finally, in 2016, I was speaking in Europe, and my wife and I drove down to southern France, and I realized we're going to be fairly close to Le Chambon. So we went and spent the night there, and then the story started to emerge. I want to write about this. So you asked about, so I didn't have, that's a long explanation to say, I just started researching this out of sheer interest in how did these people, what was motivating them, what was underneath this remarkable feat of radical hospitality. As I was, moving toward the completion of the book and writing it, what stunned me is how the events happening in 1940s in France intersected what's going on in large parts of the world, but certainly in North America right now. And I would say in a couple of areas that I think we're more in an age of ideology than of ideas. And that was the 40s in Europe. And the difference between ideology and ideas is ideas are interesting and you can have very vigorous even conversations, even arguments about them, but you don't hate the other person because they, in fact, a really healthy society flourishes on the kind of back and forth of ideas. Is this economic system better than that economic system? And so it progresses through this kind of clashing of ideas, but it doesn't become this sort of test of orthodoxy or test of your moral virtue, that I like this idea better than that idea. The ideas are just, complicated and interesting. Ideology is where, if you don't like my ideas, and you're an evil person, and if I could, I would lock you up. And that was Europe, or in the especially Nazism in the 40s, and it looks more like our current moment. That is very ideological in its cast, and this sense of villainizing, demonizing the person who doesn't share your view of, whatever the good life is. So that thing happened. The other thing is that ideology, one of the tests or measures of it, is not what you're willing to die for, but what you're willing to kill for. And whereas real true, a real commitment to a higher way or a better way is you're not willing to kill for it, but willing to die for it. And so this entire village, led by Thrakme, was willing to die, and some of them did. And Thrakme came close to being killed for his convictions. So that sort of commitment that I'm not going to kill anybody for this. I'm not going to hurt anybody. I'm not going to imprison anybody if they don't agree with me, but I will die for what I believe. Over against, I believe this, and I'm going to, crush the opponents. And that again was, that defined Nazism. We won't, I guess they were willing to die for it, but more than anything, willing to kill for it. And I think we're more in that sort of space right now, culturally, where if we want to so impose our sense of what the right and true way is, that we're willing to kill other people for it rather than risk our own lives. So those two things especially really, really stood out to me as the writing and the research emerged.
That's so fascinating how that story came to you years ago, and now that it's out in the world, it's almost like you're seeing these parallels with what the world is like.
I think what happened is I was going to write a story about then, 75 years ago, and I think I did that. I've been faithful to the historical record, but I only discovered in the last 3 years it's also about now.
Yeah, that's amazing. If there was one spiritual lesson that you want the reader to take away from this book, what would you say that is?
Yeah, I love that question. One of the things that was surprising to my wife and I, we've been to this little village 3 times, and we're living in it when we had to leave because of COVID. They're not really friendly, and they're kind of keep to themselves. And that's as I researched, that's kind of their history. They're not as super friendly. I thought they were going to be like, "Hey, welcome, come to our house," and all of that. But there's not that, and I really wrestle with that. And what I realized is the gospel will always make us better than our upbringing. So if we've grown up, have stranger danger, whatever, and that's a great principle to teach children. But sometimes we have to navigate it differently in our adulthood. The gospel will call us beyond our upbringing, always. Even if we had a great upbringing, it'll transcend it. If we've been taught generosity, we'll become more generous. Or if we've been sort of taught a sort of a tight-fistedness, we'll become generous. The gospel will always pull us beyond our upbringing. Ideology will always make us worse than our upbringing. So one of the most sophisticated, advanced civilizations on the planet was Germany. In the incredible philosophy, art, science. I mean, this was a highly sophisticated society that descended into barbarism, and deeply Christian culture that descended into this barbarism, because the ideology made them worse than their upbringing. And so I would say to listeners, are you better? Is the gospel made you better than what what you learned in your home? And it might have been a great home, but is it actually taking it beyond that? Or is whatever you believe making you a lesser version of what your mom and dad and grandpa told you and taught you? I think if it's a lesser, then you've embraced an ideology, and if it's a greater, then you're actually living the gospel.
Love that. I love that. I just want to encourage listeners. This is an excellent book. I loved so much about it. You're a very poetic writer. Even when you were saying you've always written fiction, I can see in the nonfiction books just kind of that warmth and vividness as I read. Even the nonfiction books, I feel like have this element of creativity in them. It just kind of comes out. So, I will have information on where listeners can get the book and all of that, and your other work as well. But is there just anything else you wanted to add, Mark, before we close out?
No, I really, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to talk with you again, Teresa, and I love the ministry that you have. And I would just simply say, you don't have to do radical, you don't have to be Truck May and save 2,500 people. Just take that next step of that's all he ever did. It's like, what's the next step toward being a person who more fully lives out the call of God to be a person of deep compassion, of deep love. And it will take a risk. It will involve a risk, but it doesn't have to be. Where he ended up and where he started are two different places. So just start.
So good. Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks for being on the show again.
You're welcome. Real pleasure.